join us again. I have the really incredible pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Kathleen Harrison, who goes lovingly by Kat. Kat is an ethnobotanist who loves to explore the relationship between plants, mushrooms, and human beings, particularly in the realms that are often hidden, such as cultural beliefs, personification of species, rituals of healing and initiation, vision-seeking modalities, and artistic creations that illustrate the plant-human relationship. I had the wonderful honor of studying with Kat this year for 2 weeks on the big island of Hawaii, and having the opportunity to visit her beautiful land and to just bask in the infinite distillations of her wisdom. It was truly a magical experience and really deepened my appreciation for the plant world and the practices and study of ethnobotany. Kat has also founded Botanical Dimensions in 1985. She did that back then with her then husband Terence McKenna. And she's been the president and director throughout all of Botanical Dimensions history and continues to manage the many projects that she has going on. I'll let her share a little bit about some of her amazing work in the Amazon and beyond, and her land in Hawaii and whatnot. She's also asked me to pass around this book to, if you'd like to sign up to be on her email mailing list, you can stay abreast of the amazing things that she's doing. I'd highly recommend considering doing her 2-week course in Hawaii called Little Planet, Big Island. And just truly phenomenal. So without further ado, let's welcome Kat Harrison.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much, and thank you, Natalie. I want to say thank you to everyone for your interest and your openness and curiosity in coming together tonight to hear three of us wonder aloud about what's going on. And I've never been to CIIS before. I'm the only one of your three speakers who did not attend school here. I didn't even know where it was. And but I've certainly heard of the school and the work, and then this organization. And yes, I had the pleasure of having Natalie and Brian, the chocolatier, and Cameron, who's also here. She was in a class about 5 years ago with me out in Hawaii for a couple of weeks. So, and Gary is a good friend from up north, and a few people that I know. So thank you for welcoming me. I have not made a slideshow. I barely have any notes, and I may not look at them. And I'm doing something that I seem to get more and more comfortable with as I age, which is I'm winging it. My most useful mantra in life came from those good old LSD days and Ram Dass himself, but we all discovered it: be here now. And I still find, of all the pearls of wisdom that I've heard, that it's the one that I most often go to and can remember, and that serves me the best day in and day out. And because I have a wondering kind of mind, and I like to parse things and see where they came from and what they might mean and what the sort of deeper resonance of them is, or the wider resonance as they expand, I tend to, I guess you could say that's analytical, but it's also, and that's a good thing that we have an analyzing mind and a categorizing mind, we humans, but also, of course, heart and wisdom and listening to nature, and all of those things come into it. So I went through half a dozen titles in my mind. Natalie generously said, you can name it whatever you want, and then no matter what you name it, you can talk about whatever you want. But since I knew that part of the theme of this organization is integration, and that's something that I think in our culture as we explore these realms. We do still have a lot to learn about, each of us individually and definitely culturally. It's given me, the last few weeks since she invited me, it's given me an opportunity to think about what are examples of methods of integration. I've been studying with people, traditional peoples. I started with the, well, actually, I'll back up. I have to say thank you to my first teacher of this sort, which was LSD back in the day, and many LSD trips in all sorts of situations before we even had the concept of it should be sacred in the place we are. It was, it was a ticket to explore. And sometimes that was with 10,000 other people all on LSD at a Grateful Dead show, and sometimes it was with my best friend in the forest, and sometimes it was, all night long by myself. Over the years, I'd say of all the different medicines that I've learned from and worked with, that I've probably done about 60% of my experiences on my own. That's the kind of investigator I am. And, but I do always like to look at the roots, and the roots of knowledge, and the roots of something that comes into being in the world now. Where was the seed of that? How did that begin? Who discovered how to use it, how to work with it? What was the folk technology? That's the term that when I teach ethnobotany, meaning the relationship between plants and people in all of its different ways, food, medicine, textiles, music, buildings, everything we make out of the natural world, really. We look at folk technology. People were, from the beginning, way back, now they keep moving it back. This week, 400,000 years we're talking about being human now. Went from 200 to 400,000 in like 1 week. And guess what? A whole bunch of different species were all bred together, so that idea of purity that certain historic people have had is just out the window completely, and we're totally mongrels. And we've been meeting problems and forming desires and recognizing that we don't know how to get to that desire yet, and then figuring out how, ever since way back. So, of course it was to feed ourselves, to take care of our young, to move out of the way of danger, to create, to find a good cave or whatever, and all the way through. And we have differentiated over those many millennia to have certain kinds of knowledge that specialized in the hands of people of a certain region or even of genders, and that plays into all of this. But when I began to get into psychedelics, I thought, okay, I was fortunate to grow up in nature with parents who really cared about that, and that was really, without us ever saying it, our family religion. And so I looked at that relationship of peoples with nature, and I thought, okay, I want to find out. They didn't have LSD before, but they had something. What was it? Where was it? And how did they know what it was out of everything that's there, and how do they work with it? Well, along the way, I had met the strangest person I ever met, which I would have fainted dead away if somebody told me you're going to marry him someday. But I wrote my mom a postcard in 1967 from Jerusalem and said, I just met the weirdest person I've ever met, but I suspect he's going to have some kind of influence on my life. 7 years later, our paths crossed again, and we fell in love and got married. That was Terence. And but in between, I was already looking at these roots, and so when it began to be talked about that there were mushrooms that were psychedelic, and it wasn't LSD, but it was something else, and nobody knew anything yet. Well, immediately, black market, 1970, there were little frozen or canned store-bought mushrooms dosed in, dubious L that were widely available, and we all ate them, and we're like, is that any different than the other thing we were doing? Can't really tell, but I don't think so. And somebody knows more about this than us, So then, in that period in the early 70s, with all of us, so many of us traveling the world, and that explosion of the quest for knowledge, and that explosion, Ron, and thank you, Ron and Gary, both for your talks and setting it up, and all the questions you've all asked tonight are so good, and we'd have to be here for a week, so we'll just see what gets talked about. But that time, I feel too, it just really changed. It strummed a string that changed everybody in a certain way, and people could choose to notice it or to insist that it hadn't happened or whatever their particular take on it was, but it made a lot more things possible, and it made many of us ask bigger and deeper questions than we had before. And so that early period in the 70s, 75, 76, was both when the psilocybin mushrooms, suddenly all the little how you can grow your own psychedelics books came out, and everybody was doing it, and we were all trying it, and there was a big cultural effort here and a little later in Europe to meet this new medicine and to understand it, and something really wonderful about it being something we could grow ourselves, and it was natural. It was an organism. Of course, we didn't know much about mushrooms then. People didn't eat mushrooms. You didn't have sections of mushrooms in your store like you have now, you know. And so we didn't even know if they were plants or what they were. People really thought it was a strange kind of plant. But we now know that mushrooms are biologically extremely different, and in terms of the path of evolution, they're much closer. They're on the branch with animals. So you're much more closely related to a shroom than you are to a plant. We love them both, but it's just interesting to think about that, and you know, that big question of how did that happen and all that branching. So in that period in the mid-70s, that interest in who knows, who has a real tradition about plant medicine of this sort, and we didn't call it medicine yet in those days either, and about mushroom medicine of these sorts, and that took us to the Amazon and to ayahuasca. And so I had the great good fortune of spending several months in the company of a really fine ayahuasquero in 1976, and working with him and his community. They used he brewed each week, so we collected from the forest and from gardens both, and brewed, and we had ceremonies 2 nights a week. We stayed, he told us, stay with the woman who hosts the ceremonies, sleep in the ceremony house, and Wednesday and Saturday nights we have ceremonies. On Saturday night, everybody around would come, the people who needed healing, and the people who came for the singing, and the people who came to just listen and curl up in the corners with their babies and not even take the medicine, and the people who were troubled with, you know, chronic alcoholism or bad habits or wife abuse and all kinds of social ills. And that would be Saturday night. There would be maybe 30 people typically. Very few women would partake, but the ayahuasquero's wife did, and the old lady who hosted us did, and I did. And I just saw some amazing things in terms of that vessel, that holding, the creation of what a vessel, what that meant to actually hold people in, and for people to be able to know that there was a boundary around this transformative process, which is very, very vulnerable. The whole idea, I understood then, was create, with the medicine and the ambiance, create total openness, which means total vulnerability, but put a really solid, beautiful boundary around it, so that any forces of ill intention or elementals or anything that might be disharmonic or unsettling can't come in, but the top open and our spirits meet, and the song carries them back and forth, and the tobacco smoke carries them back and forth. And there were many kinds of etiquette that I learned then that I still have a really hard time being okay with our more modern variations on them, you know. People there's an inside and an outside. You create the purity of the inside, so when you purge, which is a part of it, and a very important part, but you go outside and you give it back to the world, and you have a responsibility to go give that back to the world out there, into the garden, into the woods, off the path, and then to come back in. And the ayahuasquero and the watchers inside don't follow you. They say you have a responsibility to walk on your own 2 feet outside and to never be outside earshot, farther than earshot, and we need to be able to hear you, wretch, and you need to be able to hear us sing, and then we'll pull you back in on that invisible tether. And so that was like discipline. There's discipline in this ceremony, responsibility, not to interrupt anybody else's experience, not to set the circle askew in any way, not to demand more attention than anybody else. Only the very ill could get that kind of attention. And then the ayahuasquero, or if there was an apprentice sometimes, or the woman, the wife, the woman of the ayahuasquero. In this case, I only worked with male ayahuasquero, but since then I've worked with several, but really the old days. So it gave me a standard where I thought, okay, I'm in an ancient process here. I am like very lucky to be able to soak up this ancient process and watch how they walk their talk the next day and the next week, and what happens in that 7-day cycle back to Saturday. Well, in the morning, people got up, and this is integration now, so I'm going to try to keep bringing it back to what I want to share with you. In the morning, people would stand from, once it was just light, fairly light, and the circle would have really quieted down, and people kind of gone to sleep or just nodding against the walls, this little room, at maybe 4 in the morning, and then so at maybe 6, when we'd hear the very first bird call, then people would get up and not talk and amble outside and take a pee and get a drink of water, and then not in a circle, but just in this sort of like outside wake up morning slow conversation. People would circulate, thank each other, nod, exchange visions if they felt like it, or exchange the seed that came to them that was the most important thing to share. One man I know, he was always just hoping to see this beautiful female spirit, and he didn't always see her, but he came back every Saturday hoping that he would see her, and he would see her maybe a quarter of the time, and he would be so thrilled if he'd seen her, and it would just like carry him for a long time. But once in a while, someone would come, say, I remember once a medical doctor from the mountains, from the Andes, was about twice as big as these people are tiny. He was really a big guy. He was the son-in-law of the lady who was hosting us. And he was a Quechua Indian from the mountains and had gone all the way to medical school, really almost unheard of thing, and had become a reductionist. He was a medical doctor, and drugs worked and x-rays worked and nothing else worked, and he had married the daughter of this woman who was completely in the other worldview, and it was a long-standing argument he was having with his mother-in-law about what's real. So it was so wonderful to be able to watch it, me, the 6-year-old budding anthropologist, to watch this discussion, because she was so sure, and he was so sure, and he was kind of a, in the way that you've noticed in our country and allopathic medicine sometimes too, a kind of a bully about there's a right way and there's a wrong way and this is the right way, and so he finally had said, okay, I'm going to dispense with our years-long argument, I'm going to just come and take this stuff that you say is so great. And he was humbled completely. He was brought to his knees, and beyond that, he was brought to writhing on the floor. And all of us just kept singing. We were signaled to just keep singing these beautiful songs that just kept emerging all through the evening. And he had several times of like getting all riled up and then being swept with leaves and the special songs and blowing on him and the tobacco being blown on him and the breath being brought in and then he would quiet down and then he would encounter something else inside himself. And so this went on several times, and I remember that next morning when we were in our first stage of integration time, he came around, this very big man, he came around first to his mother-in-law and got down on his knees on the ground and said, "I'm really, really sorry that I doubted you, because everything you've said all these years is true, and I just have to think about everything again now." And then he came to each of us and on his knees and said, "Thank you so much for being part of waking me up." So that was an example in a fairly traditional, I mean, this was a mixture of, the ayahuasca was Kokama, an indigenous man, but there were, because this was Pucallpa, not Shipibo, but people, but there are many cultures around there, and because it's the river, the upper Amazon, the Ucayali, there are many cultures that come together on the rivers. They're like the highways, or they used to be, of the Amazon. So there were mestizo people, meaning mixed, you know, some Spanish blood and some indigenous blood, and then different indigenous people. And on the Wednesday night of each week, 3 or 4, or at the most 5 of the very experienced ayahuasca people would come together. And they'd come to the same place. And it would be the doctors, the doctores of that way of medicine, getting together to try a variation on the brew, because they're always brewing these, and you know, ayahuasca is never the same twice, even if the same person is using the same plants to make the same recipe, and usually that's not even that regular. But even if they're doing that, you can never make the same minestrone twice, right? Never. So it's the same with ayahuasca. And then if you add all those other factors, all the, you know, what we don't even understand about the cosmos and the zeitgeist and what these currents are that are flowing through and that are zapping us and that are blessing us and undermining us and all of these things all the time, the invisible forces, then you're in a culture like indigenous people around the world, traditional people around the world, that believes in that the invisible is populated, totally populated with all the spirits of nature, all the spirits of what you take in, what you grow, the objects and the mana in them that you have in your house, the ancestors who are always there somewhere, closer or farther, the invisible allies, the beings, good, bad, beautiful, ugly, that float around in the atmosphere. I mean, it would be like there'd be 1,000 beings in this room, not 100 people, you know? So it's a very, very rich way of living in the world, but also it means you have to just be paying attention on a level that I don't think anyone in our culture even, it's exhausting, you know? You have to be reading the intentions, the vibration, the energy, the baggage, the space itself, not only of matter but of spirit in all of these ways all the time. And then you take a powerful psychedelic. That was just, you know, your daily life. And then you take a powerful psychedelic. So that's why you need that vessel. That's why you need that being held, and you need, in those situations, they feel you need someone who, I mean, I'm using different metaphors here, but who can sail the boat, who can steer, who can see, or the waves are getting big over that way, let's see if we don't go, we'll sing the song a little differently, we'll change the wind a little bit. They invoke the wind, they calm the wind. When they brush, you know, all know if you've been brushed with leaves or you've been brushed with a fan in the northern Native American tradition, bringing in the wing and moving the air. That's an invocation of the wind, aventar in Spanish, to bring in the wind, to ask the wind to come and help keep things moving. Because one of the principles of medicine work is to keep things moving. When we have pain in us, especially if we have old pain, like trauma or childhood, something, you know, things we haven't let go of, it tends to become like a cyst. It's coated and it sits deep in there, and that's why it's so hard to get to. So if you understand that one of the principles of medicine work is to set up these currents and these breezes and keep things moving, that's what the constant of the rattle is. That's what the constant singing in a rhythmic way is. That's the leaves, you know, that are coming over your head, because you're always getting the rhythm in there. And when somebody's really scared, to sweep them down, when they're really leaden, to sweep them up, they sweep right up the spine and out the top of the head to get them to become alive again, you know. When if you have a child here who you see gets all so excited that they are like bursting, you know, if any of you have been around children, you know that feeling, you know, it's like the birthday party freak out thing. It's just all so good and so much that I'm just going to completely freak out. Which, if it's contagious, you're really in trouble because the other kids. But so that's like brush them down. I mean, and you can really distract a kid by grabbing some leaves and starting sweeping the air around them, and they'll be like, oh, that's really interesting. So, but these are ancient techniques, and I think they're universal. So part of what I like to look at are universal techniques for managing energy and emotion, and also and protection. Protection is such a big part of the reality of these cultures. I've also worked the last 20 years with a lineage, a particular family in the Mazatec region, not in Huautla, but out in the hills more, and it's been a comparative, I mean, it's been lots of things. All of these are just, you know, like family and huge heart-opening experiences. But it also is, for me, a study, a comparative study. Okay, now if I understand how people do medicine work in this place, and then I see that they do it in that place with what are the patterns that are similar, then that will tell us what are the universal tools that might be of help to any of us. And it doesn't mean we have to do them exactly the same way, but we largely European here, maybe a smattering of, you know, Native and African and some other things, but, you know, we're all displaced and we're all disrupted in our traditions. And a few fine things come through, maybe some favorite recipes or something, but not these ways of perceiving nature and working with the land and working with the energy that comes into your body, or helping someone who's gone through, well, we don't do initiations in our culture, so we get initiated by accident generally, and it's often by trauma. That's the growing up initiation with no integration and no follow through, you know. So we need these techniques, and we are a small population of people who are interested in healing and energy, and with or without psychedelic medicine, but with it makes us an even more particular small population of people who I think we have to fulfill that role of learning about these things and passing it on and trying it. And not all of us are meant to be the ones who go out there and immerse ourselves in it and come back and talk about it. I chose that path. I chose to be a go-between. I saw early on, okay, I'm enough of an outsider. I grew up as a kind of an outsider, and I was comfortable with that, in some ways more comfortable than being an insider. So I just thought, okay, I'll just keep on roaming around, looking at other ways of seeing reality, what it is, and how people manage it for their well-being, and then come back and tell people about it. And then other people really practice it day to day more. Some of you do, I'm sure, and some of you are here studying these kinds of things. And other people are looking to be healed for themselves or for someone in their family. And they are most motivated, as many of us are, motivated to heal what's broken in us. So, let's see, to finish up with the integration, what I saw in the Amazon way back in the 70s was that the diagnostic process really is a key part to designing kind of the integration that will follow. And the diagnostic process is a combination of, when going into the medicine state, of becoming self-aware, but if it's your first time, or if there's something really, really terribly painful that you've been holding down, and this suddenly feels like it's going to let it erupt and become visible to you again, or you're just inexperienced, and fearful, then it's not only the self-discovery process, but the practitioners, the people who are trained in helping people in whatever cultural tradition this is, who help someone, and in the old style, there are different, branches of the ayahuasca phenomenon, but in the way I learned was the riverine indigenous becoming mestizo traditions of Peru, and I've worked in Ecuador as well, but similar sort of traditions, and so different than the Brazilian churches, which some of you may know of, and they're also fine, but just a different style, sort of. So let's see, where's my train of thought there? Diagnostic, yes, thank you. So and this is what I saw backed up by my Mazatec work a little later when I got to really working with them, is that there's a way of seeing imbalance once you develop the eyes to see it. And there are sort of invisible meridians. If you know acupuncture, and you've seen those marvelous acupuncture body maps that are on the walls of a practitioner's office, it always reminds me of that. They're like, there are even some old engravings of native people of the Amazon that have these designs tattooed all over their bodies, these dotted lines and these very geometric, very balanced all over. Well, these are, as I've been told, these are the designs of the equivalent of meridians of the way energy works in the body. And if you have developed the eyes to be able to see those when you're on the medicine, or maybe if you get really good, not even on the medicine, I don't know, then you see that those designs become swirled or faded or just dark, almost like bruises in some part of the body. And that is a way of reading, oh, that's where that problem is. Now that problem may be physical, maybe that you have a bad liver and so your designs are all bad there, or it may be emotional. And that's where it gets really tricky then, reading into it, what is that? Because if I were the ayahuasquera, singing the song, making the beat, and trying to see my people that I'm the guardian of in that evening, then I'm looking for out of balance patterns. How I learned it is health is balance. And to answer someone's question from earlier, you don't get balanced and get to stay that way forever after. You seek balance all the time, but there are many different influences and forces, and whistle and blow, and then say, have you been true? Just something as seemingly abstract as that. And in this one case that I saw, she knew exactly what that meant, and she said no. And he said, and in what way have you not been true? Just whispering, but I was nearby. And she said, I sleep with my husband's brother. And he said, and it's your womb that aches, isn't it? And she said, yes, it aches all the time. And he said, stop sleeping with your husband's brother. And she said, okay. And, and we sang another song over her. And I just thought, oh, okay, that was really succinct, She was so grateful the next day. I mean, in a way, you might wonder, why did she need somebody to tell her that? But then, is that to know that that's what it might be that made her ache in that way. This is where the skill comes in. And to be able to elicit it, to set her up, to be open enough to elicit it and have her make a decision about her life. And then in the next morning, and she knew that half a dozen people at least had heard this. So she was witnessed as well, and so in the morning, the acknowledgement to each other before we parted ways in the dawn to go back on the trails and back to where we lived. That was part of the integration. years later, when I really started working with this Mazatec family, and I have to say, both my main indigenous teachers of medicine, have been men, and absolutely brilliant, sensitive, quiet, wonderful men. I didn't marry a quiet man, you may know. But neither of them I saw early on, and then I kept watching over the years, and I confirmed. I have never seen a good ceremonial leader or really ethical healer who's working in that way with these medicines and all in ceremony, who works alone. I always see a dyad. And the dyad isn't always a man backed up by a woman. I have also seen a woman backed up by a man. More often, when the healer is a woman, I see her backed up by her sister or her niece or someone who has worked with her, more often with a woman, but sometimes I have seen a woman backed up by a man. I just think it really, I actually had a group of students with me in the Ecuadorian Amazon about a dozen years ago, and we went to a Quechua couple that had been practicing as ayahuasqueros for, I think 40 years or something. They were in their late 70s. And he was the one who was called the maestro. He was the ayahuasquero that everybody around there called, but everybody also knew that he couldn't do anything without her. And so my students were asking him all the questions. I was translating for them and asking him the questions. And it was, the first big clue was when they said to him, "How many children do you have?" And he said, "I don't know." And he turned to his wife. She said 7. So they're like, okay. And then one of the students said, "And what is your recipe for your ayahuasca?" And he said, "Well, we use some of the bark and some of the leaves." And then he turned to his wife, and she said exactly the recipe, And so then a couple of questions long afterwards, and they were funny with each other. They were like cute 16-year-olds. They were holding hands and stuff, And then a couple of minutes later, it was, would you ever take ayahuasca all by yourself? And he said, "Absolutely not. I need someone to watch my back. I need someone at least as powerful as I am to watch my back, to be able to do the thing that I would take the ayahuasca to do, to look into something, to come back with something safely, better than I went out, at least as good as I went out." And he said, "She's more powerful than I am. I trust her with my life. She watches my back." And then one of us asked her, "Would you take ayahuasca?" And she said, "I can't take ayahuasca. He's not as powerful as I am, and I need someone as powerful as I am." But I just think it's interesting to please remember, because we still, psychedelic or not, we have gender issues, we have sexism, we have all that stuff, we have, all the isms are still alive in our world that we live in, even as we are working to be more awake. And so question every part of reality. That, for some reason, I was raised to do that, and I am really grateful for it. It's made me a skeptic of many things, and I'll jump aside here a little bit. I didn't, let's see, do I want to do that? I think I'll go back to diagnostics and Mazatec's and integration. Okay, so what I saw there when I got to the Mazatec family, for whom I had an introduction, but they wouldn't take me in until I proved myself. Wouldn't even let me in the door to have a conversation. This is old style. This is multi-generational. Started, you're recognized by age 11 if you've got it to become a healer. He was recognized, this man, he's still alive, 89. He was recognized when he was 11, so that was, a long time ago, 1920 or something. by his uncle, who was an old ayahuasquero. And he was taken away from his mother and father and siblings, and they're all out in the boondocks, or they used to be, but to a, tiny cabin way up on a high mesa in these mountains in southern Mexico. And he was trained for years and years. I heard some different versions, but something like 12 years. And meanwhile, certain girls are recognized as having the skill to become a healer's partner. So he didn't know his future wife, but it was recognized when she was a little girl that she had the temperament that might make that possible. And so she was trained, and they knew that someday someone would come along who needed a woman who knew how to do these things and how to back him up, basically. And he recognized her the moment he saw her. She was 14 and he was 25, and they've been together ever since. 14 is the typical traditional marrying age in the Mazatecs. And the Mazatecs were polygamous until fairly recently. But so this recognition, once they kind of said, okay, you look real, we'll let you come, drop the Mazatec guy who helped you find our distant tiny cabin, because we're not going to talk to you if he's there. We don't know who he is or what he's carrying, in energy. But because I had an introduction from someone that they respected, I was able to get to know them. And then they spent the next couple of days, this is the old curandero, his wife, and they don't even speak Spanish, only Mazatec, and then their grown son, who spoke both. And so I spoke Spanish. We did this two-way translation. They asked me about my life. They asked me what was troubling me. I had come for a cure and hoping for one. And they had never worked on somebody from outside before, and outside the culture. And so we worked with Salvia Divinorum. And it's a long story, and I want to tell you other things tonight, so I'm not going to say that. But what I learned in that process is that they asked me my story, and there were certain things in my story where they noticed, oh, okay, trigger points, sort of, or oh, something might have happened at that point. So they're like making notes, mental notes on moments of possible loss of balance in my life. Later I found out that the phrase, and it's even quoted in the translation of one of Maria Sabina's songs, is to follow the path of the track of your hands. That means to follow backwards in time, in experience in your life, what you've done. Our hands are what do things, right? So what have your actions been? What have your interactions been? What have you made? What have you held? What have you lost? If you follow the path of the track of your hands back into time, you will find the moment when something broke, you lost your balance. And if you can get a clue as to what that is by this sort of downloading psychotherapeutic, exchange, storytelling before the ceremony, and then you go into the ceremony, then they can sing you back to that moment and turn things around and guide you back to the present with that having been turned and solved. That's really an amazing skill set, and that's an amazing worldview, that's possible, and that's how we're made, And so it happened in the Salvia session, which is a very short and super intense experience, eating the leaves, that I was able to find a little door in my heart that I didn't know was there, and I didn't know it was there, and I didn't know it was stuck, and I didn't know it was so beautiful and so stubborn. Those two things. And it just poof, blew open. It never closed again. And it was about love. It was about a broken heart on a bunch of different levels, But I really feel that finding it in their minds before I recognized it and taking me to it and showing it to me is what allowed the healing to happen, So then I did learn from another, I worked with a couple of curanderas there, they're called healers, curanderas, and I learned from a couple of Mazatec curanderas that I did ceremonies with back in the 90s, that there's also they see it as sort of a pattern of lights. And one of them said it's like those tiny Christmas lights that some people down there they had seen if they didn't live too far out in the sticks, you know, that are so common here. But there's a network of them, very similar to what I heard in the Amazon, a network of design of tiny colored lights all over us. And that if someone's trying to diagnose you, they will look at those, and where they're dim or where they're askew or whatever, they will know how to work. So it's just to give you some idea of these other ways of seeing that are helpful for working with in these states. There's a whole, I was saying about all the beings that populate the spaces between things, and so there's a whole concept which I'm sure you know of, because anyone who's studied initiation knows that one of the design of the initiation experience, whether it's a designed and intentional one because it's a coming of age or it's about to enter into a new stage, or if it's an accidental one through exposure to some horrific thing or some huge challenge, it's called a descent. It's the shamanic descent. It's the descent into the underworld, underwater, the darkness, the place of complete alienness and strangeness. And part of what you do to get through that initiation is you find out what you're really made of. You have to find your courage. And your courage doesn't mean you're like a gloriously brave person. It doesn't. You're terrified. And you are trying to get from here to here to here to here to keep going. You're alive and you're trying to stay alive. And that's a real initiation, when you're not sure on whatever level we use the word alive. You're not sure that you're going to make it through alive. So we are beings who are born, our motivation of the organism is to stay alive. And when you find that, you find your own strength, but in the process of seeking that, even if you found yourself in there, you may still need help to get out of this situation, whatever it is, if it's inside your mind, or if it's in the worst car accident you've ever heard of, or if it's because, your mother died and you're just a little kid, or whatever the thing is that just made, the hardest thing you can imagine happen. You need help getting through there. And all these cultures, and all of our own ancestral cultures, every one of us has the belief that there are allies, that there are at least a couple ancestors out there who give a hoot about the continuation of human beings, of this family line, maybe even specifically about you, and there are, for whatever reason, like in any room of strangers, there are a couple of people you could really connect with, right? That you didn't know before, you just feel it. And if it were a cocktail party, we'd probably figure it out by the end of the evening. Yeah, I met somebody I really like, I think I'll see them again after that event, So it's that way in the invisible world too. There are people who can sign up to be one of your allies. And you need to recognize that that's possible. You need to be able to recognize them. You need to be able to ask. You need to be humble. All of these things, but that's how we get allies. And those allies aren't just for that evening or for that drama. They are for life. And they say if you get 3 allies, whether they're ancestors or elementals or odd beings from another culture or planet or whatever, who just show up, if you recognize them and value that, then they will be, and you get 3 in your lifetime. You are really lucky if you have 3 allies you've really met. And to know, well, when you get to integration and you say, what did I get from that experience? If you got an ally out of that experience, you got a treasure, And that's part of what you would know, whether you chose to talk about it or not. Sometimes, and we're such a verbal culture, that we have this idea that we need to share everything, But as you know, this is, the psychedelic experience is one of the hardest things to describe, isn't it? I mean, sex is pretty hard to describe, but it's right up there with that kind of thing. And and I don't think that we necessarily should put it on ourselves that we have to put it into words, but we need to value it as highly as possible, whether or not we can put it into words. I think sometimes we get confused that if you can't say what something is, it doesn't have value, or it's evanescent, and it just sort of evaporates, And so part of integration is remembering. It's finding what you can recognize clearly enough, cognize clearly enough. So if you cognize it, it goes into your cognition, you can recognize it, you can recognize it later, And I find when I'm going into a trip, and this might be, and I use, I use the old hippie words. I love them, psychedelic, tripping, but they taught me well, but when I'm going on any kind of a trip, if it's a week by myself in a cabin to draw and contemplate, or if it's a night on medicine, or it's a family reunion with the somewhat beloved but alcoholic relatives, or whatever it is, that's sort of the, oh, okay, now I need to do this voyage of discovery, then I always, for me this works, I try to think, I am going to remember very clearly, like completely 360 degrees photograph with my whole being here now, three things in this episode. And if I can remember really clearly 3 things that I understood, 3 little lessons that are phrases or that are just visual maybe, and come out of it with those still intact, so that days later I can say what those 3 things were, they will have like little tethers to all kinds of other understanding. And I'll come through this experience with more gems than if I go, oh, I'm going into the stew, and I don't know, as long as I can get out of the stew at the end, then good for me, but it's pretty hard to sort anything out in there. And you may have had trips like that are not managed well by a ceremonialist, or where you took too large a dose, or where you were with the wrong people, or mixed up the wrong substances, or whatever it is, where it just becomes like a tempest. And so that the mnemonic method of finding points to remember, and then knowing that those will help you map what you learned while you were in that state, I find to be very useful. And when I get out to the other side, I write them down. If I am capable of it in one of my solo experiences, I do keep a notebook beside me. I can't always remember what a pen is or what a notebook is, but if I can, I will write down a couple of words, that just are like little keys, so that I can open that door again later. And sometimes I will just make the simplest little sketch. When I was, I have 2 grown children, and through a combination of planning and accident, they came just close enough together that I hadn't quite finished nursing one before I got pregnant with the next one. So I went without tripping, back in this era where this is my life's work and Terence's life's work and all of this, for 7 years, surrounded by people who thought it was all about psychedelics. It was in the late 70s and early 80s. And in that 7 years, I just thought, well, I'm not going to take anything. I know there are traditions that say you can, but we just don't know enough about it. And so I'm just going to be, clean and pure, and it's a really good opportunity to be in the awareness. And I really treasure, actually, how clearly I remember not only the miracle and beauty of my little children and the birthing and all of that stuff, but my awareness then, trying to be consciously in that level of psychedelic awareness while I was taking care of little children and doing all the daily, life that generates, and coming back out to the other side then when I had weaned the second one and I felt I could go away, then how I kept my kind of artist-writer sanity healthy was twice a year for a while, for about 6 or 7 years there. I would go up to borrow a little cabin up the coast, up the Sonoma or Mendocino coast, and go when it was real quiet on a Sunday afternoon and come back on a Friday afternoon before the whatever weekend tourism would happen. And I would take my notebook and my drawing materials and a couple of kinds of medicine with me, usually LSD and mushrooms. And early in the week I would take one and I would make notes and I would write from that and I would draw. I would sketch during it, just the roughest stuff, and then I would draw that out into the next level of drawings, and then I'd wait a couple of days and integrate that, and I had lots of walking and lots of, breathing, the best thing of all. And then I would take the other medicine and do it again. And so partly it was me, because I'm part scientist, so it was partly me comparing same conditions, 2 different medicines repeatedly each year. Partly it was the mom a little overwhelmed with mom-ism and trying to go out and find herself and keep herself going in that way, And I so fondly remember those times. I recommend it to you or to people who are feeling, buried, hungry for insight and don't know how to find it, is if you can manage a little time out and feel entitled to it, recognize that you're entitled to it, and give it to yourself, and make the most of it. It's just, it's a really good way of taking that time also to integrate. And I'll say one more thing about integration, and then how are we doing on time? 15 minutes to go? Yeah. Okay, I'll stop and then we'll take questions. So I just was going to say, let's see. Oh, I just shouldn't have asked that because I lost what I was going to say. What's that?
Solar retreat.
Solar retreat, yes. Integration, yes, thank you. Yes, taking time, thank you. And so it sounds like at Spirit House you work, and many people who do in this crowd here would know that integration time is essential. That's what I was going to say. Among the Mazatecs, what I found is that they say for the 24 or 48 hours before you're going to do a ceremony, an inquiry of this sort, begin to close the avenues that people have to you. Don't go to the marketplace, which they all have open markets, but where you're going to have many conversations and people are watching who you're not always even noticing who's watching you, or you're just, somebody could have an argument right in front of you, or you could, a donkey could die in your path, or, all kinds of things could happen that you can't control, and it will just fill you, and when you get into that state, you'll have that imagery, you'll have that energy in you. So begin to protect yourself before you move to that, and then go into the ceremony. And of course there's all kinds of stuff about exchanges and everything else, we can't talk about it all, but go into the ceremony and then come out, and they'll bring you back out, and then there's the next day, and then you have to be very careful to take care of yourself in certain ways, because you've opened everything up. And if you leave the circle in the ceremony where somebody else is protecting you, you've got to be protecting yourself, and a lot of people don't know how to do that. We really don't, where we think everybody should talk to everybody else, and you should be, hi, how are you doing? I don't know, who the heck are you? They just go don't do that, And they say, close yourself in different ways. Don't open the door to a knock unless you know who it is. It's your sister or someone, you hear their voice outside. Don't walk down the street 3 days. Just don't walk out there and make yourself, you are like a sponge for energy. And unconsciously, if not consciously, everyone else will recognize it and fill you with the energy, particularly, maybe unconsciously, things they don't want. They're like, oh, there's a sponge, I'll just give all that to them, So you don't want to be a sponge. You don't want to be out there without somebody watching out for you. Anyway, it's a good chance to stay home, because then you can meditate on what you've just experienced. You can integrate all that you've just learned. Also, they believe in people I've worked with believe in the humors. So the old, notion that we know, some of us from European herbal medicine, of the hot and or from Chinese medicine also, the hot and the cold, or the warm and the cool, and the damp and the dry. And that, there's arguments about whether that arose in Native American cultures or whether it was an early import of the medieval Spanish coming in. But either way, they embraced it and they believe in it, and everything's got its allocation. And they say the mushrooms are, this is no surprise, some of them are counterintuitive, but they say the mushrooms are energetically cool and damp. So you should take in what is warm and dry, because you need to balance it. You balance everything. They dose the mushrooms in pairs, the masculine and the feminine. They dose everything, every kind of medicine, anything of any importance in pairs, because you always acknowledge the masculine and the feminine. And they say, the people I work with say, drink cinnamon tea. Cinnamon bark tea is dry and warm. Now we know it's warm, but it's also energetically dry. Of course, it doesn't come from Central America, so me, the ethnobotanist, I try not to argue with them, but it comes from Southeast Asia. So they can't have been using it for more than a couple of hundred years at the very most, but they probably had something else and it was just better, so they've adopted it. I actually once asked them a trick question, because I knew when coffee had been brought to Mexico and started to be propagated and got up to those mountains like in 1870, and they grow their own coffee, and they make coffee, and they always have a weak, sweet coffee, but always simmering on the fire. There are people who cook on open fire. And so I said, you love the coffee, and the coffee really helps you, and yes, and we drink, it's the only liquid they drink is like super weak coffee all the time, because it's sterilized water also, because it's boiling. And I said, so how long have you had the coffee? And everybody just said to me, forever. Coffee is life. We could not be here without coffee. And I was like, well, that's how it is in Northern California, Okay, well, I'm going to open it up to questions. Yes?
So you were saying there are certain patterns that you saw, and you mentioned some of them in your talk, and are there any ones that you haven't mentioned that you see are patterns in indigenous cultures around the world?
Patterns of behavior that have to do with ceremonial...
Or just optimal ways of having ceremony and having people have better lives from ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
What those routines are.
There are, I don't know if I'm going to be able to elicit them right now, but it has so much to do with this kind of breath, wind, movement, vibration, that whole theme in all different ways. Sweeping the space, sweeping the, placing objects of symbolic magic in different places that denote the edges or bring renewal, and there's always this concept of renewal, it's interesting because these are old traditions, but there's some kind of a very careful love of innovation in them. And I noticed that in the Mazatec prayers that I have been able to understand or have translated, that freshness is one thing that they pray for. And I think you'll find this if you do a careful reading of so many recordings were made of Maria Sabina, and the people I know just look at her as like, oh yeah, one of thousands of Mazatec healers, not, the queen of shamans. But on the other hand, she caught the world's attention, and she turned the paradigm toward all of this. And she was recorded and documented in so many ways. So her songs, the translations of her songs, which you can find in the Big Wasson books and a couple of other books, are very interesting. They're her songs, and everyone has their own songs, but there are many motifs in the songs that are part of their whole worldview. And one of the things that she and Don Rutilio, whom I work with, both say is that they pray for freshness. They have a deity of the dew, a goddess of the dew. And when the goddess of the dew visits at 4 in the morning, they welcome her, and they know that we need in our constant cycles, we need freshness. And so that is so interesting in a place where tradition was held and kept alive underground for 500 years, praying for freshness. Yeah.
Hey Kat, thanks for that wonderful shamanic discourse. I'm particularly fascinated with the holographic model that you depict the nature of reality and our world to be like in a shamanic sense, and especially when you can recall incidences and recall them and bring them back up and being able to see the meridians. I've actually always felt like that's natural, some part for us as human beings. One shaman in Iquitos, Artiduro, he would just through intuition be able to search out a plant that was needed, and he could like read the forest. It's just incredible what is possible. Mm-hmm. But we live here in San Francisco, and there's this technological infrastructure encompassing our world, and I just wonder, in your perception, is it like a crossroads scenario, or are these two realms like something that could be supplemental, or is it something that you only could choose one way, the nature neuroplasticity or the technological neuroplasticity?
Well, that's a simple little question. Thank you, though. What it makes me think of is when, I don't know that this exactly answers it, but it's partly. Back there in '76, when Terence and I brought ayahuasca back with us from South America, we brought what we felt was enough for several years, which we used for several years, to keep on investigating all of this. It was brewed by the person we loved and trusted. And the first time that we took it, we were living in a little place up in the Berkeley Hills at the time. And it was not anything like any ayahuasca experience that I'd had in the forest or with these people, not at all. It was simply ayahuasca in my body looking at this world. And my eyes were being used and my brain was being used. When I first realized that I didn't know where I was, it was a place that even I hadn't been, I knew it was an East Coast city. It was a slum in an East Coast city. There were homeless people, there were children, black children playing on stairs, and trash cans burning, and litter, bottles and cans and papers blowing in the streets. And I just thought, wow, I've never, what is this, Baltimore or something? I have just never seen this, certainly not on ayahuasca. And then it began to move into where I saw a supermarket, and then I was a hippie and I didn't own anything, and I suddenly was looking at rows and rows of products in a supermarket and labels, and zooming over them and looking in and then coming around. It was just like I was being worn by my perceptions in this place were being worn by this plant spirit. And it was examining, where have I gotten to now? What is this world? If I'm going to operate in this world, I have to know where I am. And so, Terence had a very similar experience. We compared later, he'd seen different things, but it was just oh, you just imported something between, one cosmos and another, and it's eager to learn. My experience, which I hadn't realized yet, was that it was ayahuasca was I don't know, it's 2 species at least, as you know, and the vine is just one of them, and so it's quite complex. But my experience of that medicine was that it was waiting for someone to come along so it could hitchhike out. Not to get away from the Amazon, just to get out there, And I have to say, we were the perfect people. We were all about, the mushrooms. We're in the Amazon looking for ayahuasca. Little did we know at the time, but moving to Hawaii soon, and why did we move to Hawaii? Who knows? Maybe that plant was just, they're pushy, and they are. And I may be a free thinker and an explorer and all this stuff in these ways, but I also don't like to be told what to do. I never have. And so I'll just tell you another experience that's kind of related to this, and since your question is unanswerable, I hope that this will do. But years later, I was in an ayahuasca ceremony. By this time, I had the 2 little children but weaned, and I was in a ceremony with a couple of beloved troopers, serious travelers like me, and at some point it was just too dense, and we had agreement to stay in a little circle, but I just said, permission, I've got to go outside. And I got up and went out and sat on the edge and looked at the stars, and I just saw this. It looked way out. I just felt like I could see just those fantastic things the Hubble telescope sees. I was just seeing them, and I saw this human heart, not a classic heart, but a human heart, way, way, way out there in space with ribbons blowing in the breeze off of it, and I was just really like the human heart way out in space. Now that is really interesting. And so I was at a moment in my life where, because my kids were just old enough that I thought, now I can just really seize what my work is in the world. And I haven't said it yet, but that's always been much my question. What is my work? What is my work for the next stretch of the path? I don't need to know the whole picture all the way for the rest of my life. I'd just like to see to the place that the path turns again, please. And so I asked that question, and the answer was from ayahuasca spirit. I felt, put the plants front and center. And I had just seen this huge human heart, and I was, on ayahuasca, and I was struck by the power and the beauty of that for a moment. And then I said, you're a plant. Of course you're going to tell me to put the plants front and center. I have 2 small children. I have to put them front and center. And it was like, well, okay, behind the children, we're negotiating. And that's how I started Botanical Dimensions. That was the night that I thought, oh, I need to make an organization that's about saving plants and plant knowledge. And so part of how it moves in the world and between worlds. So thank you very much. I think we can have a panel, and I don't even know what time it is. Are we doing okay? Okay, thank you very much.